Hey class, I know it stinks being away from school, but I'm going to try to keep moving through the content a little bit with the United States and World War One. So here you go, major conflict. You know it, you've studied it before, you will study it again. Europe drastically changes because of World War One, and today we're going to figure out why and how the United States plays a role in that. So here are the alliances. You see the blue are the Allied powers and the yellow are the Central powers. Why does it start? Very simply, there's an issue between Serbia and Austria-Hungary where a Serbian nationalist shoots the Austria-Hungarian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And in terms of the fighting, let's talk about the Western Front because that's where the U.S. is going to get involved and that's the most significant to them. What happens on the Western Front? Well, let me get you to U.S. involvement by teaching you one battle, the First Battle of the Marne. So this is called the Schlieffen Plan. This is the German plan to win the war. They're coming from Germany and going up to touch the sleeve of the rightmost man is supposed to touch the English Channel and come around and take Paris from behind. That's the goal, and they do very well for a very long time until they make a mistake, and they were supposed to come all the way around and touch the English Channel. You see they cut in towards Paris, and they create a hole in their line right here that enables the French to exploit that and win the battle, the First Battle of the Marne. That victory of that particular battle spooks the Germans a little bit. They think they've moved too quickly, and both sides try to flank one another from the Battle of the Marne all the way to the English Channel. This is called the Race to the Sea. This is all going on in 1914. Throughout that process of the French trying to flank the Germans trying to flank the French, we end up digging these long networks of trenches, and there's pretty much a stalemate for the next 3 years because of it. This is what goes on in World War I. It's trench warfare. You see one group, one side, come up out of their trenches, cross the middle, which is called no man's land, and get shot by a bunch of machine guns on the way. World War I, from a military perspective, was a sunk cost. We should have stopped right away, but we just kept pouring resources and men into this, and they just kept slaughtering each other. And these trenches barely even moved for 3 years while both sides were slaughtering each other. So you can see the trenches from above too. You can see them. They cut these intricate patterns to protect themselves. How do you break trench warfare? Well, the reason this goes on for so long is because it's very difficult to do so. So we have this issue here where they decide they're going to start using chemical bombs on each other and chemical warfare. And if you want, you can pause the video and look at those. The British developed these tanks. They're, I think, the first to really use these tanks, but they're incredibly inefficient. And then, of course, as you saw on the previous slide, there's airplanes too. So there's all these new technologies and chemical warfare. These are the ways to try to break trench warfare. Incredibly hard to do. These technologies weren't really adequate in doing that. The machine gun was the technology of World War I. Tanks and planes and all that are going to be super important in World War II. They exist in World War I. They just altogether weren't that effective. So while all that trench warfare is going on, what's the United States up to? The easy way to say why did the U.S. enter World War I if you have to hang it on one thing, a lot of Americans say, oh, the sinking of the Lusitania. Lusitania was a British passenger ship that 128 Americans were on, and it got sunk by a German U-boat. So again, submarine new technology mattered in this war, but wasn't altogether conclusive towards either side winning. Obviously, Germany lost. Why did the Germans sink it? This is a passenger liner, but it was a passenger liner on which they believed there was munitions to help France and Britain against the Germans, so they sunk it. It's true. There were munitions on the ship, but it really drives Americans angry. So eventually the Germans say, okay, we'll stop sinking passenger ships. And this is after they sink the Sussex, which is a French passenger liner. And they say, well, okay, we'll stop doing that. And so that makes Wilson happy. And Wilson has been trying really hard to maintain neutrality. And he needs to make sure that his industries and his citizens can travel across the Atlantic. And even though his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, had said, don't cross the Atlantic on a French or a British passenger liner, plenty of Americans were still doing it. And even though Wilson wanted neutrality, plenty of American businesses and banks were still trading heavily, more so with France and England than they were with Germany. So eventually Germany decides that they're going to continue unrestricted submarine warfare because of the stalemate going on the Western Front. They think this will help. And they also try to forge an alliance with Mexico, and they send the Zimmerman telegram to Mexico to ask if Mexico will invade the United States. And they said they'll give them back their land from the Mexican-American War that they lost then. And so between those couple of things, the Lusitania and the Sussex Pledge, unrestricted submarine warfare coming back, the fact that the Germans were trying to ally with the Mexicans, And then finally, the fact that the Russians had just surrendered in 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution is going on and Russia's going to engage in the Civil War, it really inspires the United States to get involved. So what do? Well, we got to build up an army to win this war, right? So one of the war things that the government does is they create a committee of public information, and they create all this propaganda to get us ready to win war, right? So you got to drastically change your economy. You got to get all these people to sign up for the military. You got to get everyone on board. And so these are some examples of that. The most famous of which is the "Destroy This Mad Brute" propaganda pieces. You know, the Germans are destroying culture, and they're militaristic, and they're stealing women, right? Trying to get people to enlist, and obviously women also end up sort of getting behind the war effort in a lot of ways, from everything from the Red Cross to making things and resources that are going to be needed to win the war. And I'm going to come back to women in a second. So the government drastically changes how the economy works. First, the government needs troops, so it's going to require all of its men to sign up for a, quote, Selective Service Act. You know, it was selective. Everyone had to sign up on one given day, and, you know, rah, patriotism, everyone did. You see the military increases drastically in size, and the government puts on strict controls on a bunch of different industries to try to win the war. And then finally, to prevent citizens from doing anything to hurt the war effort, they passed the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, say that you can't speak out against the government, or if your loyalty is questioned and you're selling secrets or anything, you can be prosecuted. And so famously, this guy named Schenck says, you should exercise your 13th Amendment right and not submit to the indentured servitude of the draft, right? So it was an anti-draft message, and he goes to jail. The Supreme Court says it's fine. And Eugene Debs, the famous socialist communist who runs for president so many times, he gets convicted of the Sedition Act. The communist line is that the World War I is this capitalist fight between these parties, these different capitalist powers to try to maintain dominance and create markets and make money. So he's in jail. He actually runs for president from jail once. African Americans in World War I, you see a couple major things. One is, here's the Great Migration. There's massive amounts of blacks going from the south to the north to take advantage of the opportunity of building resources to win the war in these different cities. And the other thing is African Americans sign up in big numbers to go to war, and they're selected into service in the war. Ironically, fighting in mixed, segregated units in the war. And if you're curious about this, I highly recommend looking up the Harlem Hellfighters, who majority are all black, but majority from Harlem, unit that actually had a lot of success fighting over in France during the war. And W.E. Du Bois is like, you know, go sign up for the war, be patriotic, and then when we get back, you know, we should be treated differently in this country for having shown our patriotism and helped win World War One. And he's not gonna get what he's looking for there. And as I said, the women, in addition to helping build resources to win the war, they also pushed at home for the right to vote again. And finally, World War I is going to be a trigger to help women get the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson, who was first against it, later comes around and says, okay, it's fine. And you see this is part of a wave of countries that are finally saying, all right, women should be able to vote. And so the women, along the same lines of what blacks are hoping for, it's like, well, we're going to help win the war. We're going to do all this stuff. We deserve the right to vote. We should get something in return. And in 1920, finally, the United States, after all these years, finally adheres to women's suffrage, and with enough states ratifying it, it becomes an amendment to the Constitution. So how does this end? Well, Wilson, right before he brings America to war, right? He tried really hard not to. He tried to get the European powers together for what he called peace without victory, to get them to realize that this was a sunk cost, and they should all just make a deal, make an agreement, and that there didn't have to be a victor in order to do that. And he also says very, very astutely, only a peace between equals can last. And so he didn't want there to be one side that was declared the victor, that got to impose what it wanted on the other side. And this ends up being really smart. But obviously the Europeans don't accept it. The Germans in particular won't go for it. And as a result, America goes to war. The fighting for the Americans in the war, there's one sort of major offensive called the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, where the United States have a lot of success. But ultimately, it's their involvement, the United States and forces' involvement was minor comparatively. But the Germans did give up, thinking here comes another million or so more, actually, troops across the Atlantic. The writing was on the wall for them. So Woodrow Wilson, he's engaged heavily in the Treaty of Versailles, which is the peacemaking process. Armistice was 11/11/1918, And then the treaty was negotiated at Versailles, and he wrote these 14 points that he thought were essential for the world moving forward after World War I. And I'm going to focus on number 14, which is the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was his idea to get people to do diplomacy, get all these countries to work together diplomatically, and to prevent something like all these secret treaties and these violations of freedom of the seas, and really to keep an eye on the things that would prevent future war. Sounds like a completely fine idea, but ultimately America is sort of trying to turn back towards isolationism after the war. And Henry Cabot Lodge filibusters Wilson's the peace treaty with the League of Nations attached. And when the League of Nations finally meets, America's not present. It doesn't pass the Senate, doesn't get the 2/3 it needs to pass the Senate, even though they tried twice. And as a result, the League of Nations is a sort of a toothless body that doesn't have the enforcement mechanism or the money or the willpower to prevent expansion when it happens right before World War II with Germany and Japan and Italy, among others. So what's next? Wilson, and trying to campaign for that League of Nations, actually suffers a stroke and sort of finishes out his years in office before passing away. And we return to normalcy, which is where we get Warren G. Harding in 1920. Right after the war, we see issues during the war with race riots. We see issues during the war with fear of communists. We see a Red Scare that comes from A. Mitchell Palmer and his lackey, J. Edgar Hoover, in the FBI, who try to root out radicals or communists as a threat to society. And this is part of America making the world safe for democracy, which is what Wilson was trying to do in his war message and getting the United States involved. We see some strikes when people return to their jobs after the war, and we see a small economic recession as well. So things aren't exactly peachy right after the war, and this is the sort of the end of the progressive era period and sort of a return to isolationism that America chooses to do, which of course is going to lead us into a second world war. We have to have World War II before we can solve the international issues that are occurring during the 20th century. So I hope this gives you a good summary of what I want to cover with the World War I. Feel free to bring questions to class tomorrow.